In the summer of 1862, on a plantation in Carolina, a boy named Isaiah was born with skin unlike the others. Pale patches that neither medicine nor prayer could explain. When the drought came, when the fields turned to dust, it was not the weather they blamed. It was the child. This is the forbidden tale of Isaiah, a child enslaved, marked by a condition science could not name. In a world ruled by superstition and cruelty, his difference became a sentence. When misfortune struck the land, drought, famine, fire, Isaiah was branded as the curse itself. This story is not one you'll find in textbooks, for history turned its face away. But here, we unearth it. Here, the record of Isaiah's suffering and the fear that silenced him will be spoken again. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the Macabre Record channel so you never miss another forbidden tale. And in the comments, tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? The year was 1862, and the Carolina summer was hotter than memory. The air carried no wind, only dust, and the sun beat down without mercy. Across the plantation fields, cotton withered into brittle stalks, the earth cracked like broken pottery, and the wells sank lower each day. Inside the quarters, families prayed for rain in whispers, their throats dry, their eyes lifted toward a sky that had long turned its back. It was in this silence, in this punishment of heat and dust, that Isaiah's presence began to draw notice. He was small, with skin marked by pale patches that seemed to glow against the darkness of his flesh, and hands that trembled when he reached for anything. His eyes carried a weight too old for his years, wide and watchful, as though always waiting for judgment. Among the children, there was no room for kindness. Their games ended when he approached. Their laughter cut sharp, filled with nicknames that clung to him, like burrs. Even the grown men and women, hardened by suffering, spoke his name in low tones, as if it carried a weight best not said aloud. His mother held him close, whispering that he was no curse, only her son, but even she could not quiet the looks that followed him wherever he went. And then came the misfortunes. A plough broke in the fields, and the whisper spread that Isaiah had walked past it the day before. A mule collapsed in the heat, and someone muttered that the boy had touched its bridle. No one saw him cause these things, yet no one needed proof. Misfortune was heavy on the land, and Isaiah's difference made him the perfect vessel for their fear. By the time the third week passed without rain, the overseers were no longer dismissing the whispers. They spoke Isaiah's name with furrowed brows and sharp glances, their voices low but certain. His mother clutched him tighter each night, as if she already knew the world around them had begun to decide his fate. Isaiah had not yet lived long enough to understand the weight of difference, but he felt it. In the mornings, when the other children were hurried to the fields to carry water, to scatter feed, or to fetch what little shade could be found, Isaiah often lingered close to his mother. She tried to make his chores lighter, knowing his trembling hands drop things, knowing his body tired quicker than the rest. Yet even in those quiet mercies, she could not shield him from the eyes that followed. The other children kept their distance. They played games of stones and sticks, but when Isaiah drifted close, the circle broke. Laughter turned sharp, nicknames flew like arrows, and a silence heavier than heat fell, until he wandered away. Some dared each other to touch his arm, to place a hand on the strange pale marks that mottled his skin, but they pulled back as though burned, spitting and muttering that the boy was unclean. He would sit alone then, shoulders folded in, listening to their voices trail behind him like thorns dragging in the dirt. His mother, Ruth, was the only shield he knew. She was a woman carved by labor, her back bent by years in the fields, but her eyes carried a softness when she looked at Isaiah. At night she brushed his hair back and whispered scripture over him, though her voice sometimes cracked when she said the word blessing. She told him he was no curse, only her precious child, and that one day people would see him for more than what their fear allowed. But even Ruth could not deny that the whispers reached her ears too. When the women gathered by the fire to cook what little corn they had, their talk slowed when she joined. They cast glances toward Isaiah, then away, shaking their heads as if the boy himself could bring sickness just by standing near. It was not cruelty alone that made them act so. In a world without answers, people reached for signs, and Isaiah's body seemed to carry one. A child born different was a story written before he could speak. A tale of bad luck, of ill fortune, of something heaven itself had turned from. The women spoke of rain withheld, of crops lost, of barns burned, and they tied his name to those losses with threads of fear that tightened every season. Isaiah did not yet understand the weight of those stories. He only knew that he was often alone, that the world seemed to shrink when he stepped into it. When his hands trembled so badly he could not hold the water bucket, the overseer cuffed him across the head, muttering about weakness, about waste, and when his legs gave out beneath him in the field, he was dragged to the shade and left there, as though to remove his shadow from the work itself. Each small humiliation, each whispered word, was another stone laid on the path he walked. A path he could not change, a path Ruth feared more with every step. For already the overseers spoke his name more often, and not with pity. They spoke it the way one might speak of a sickness that threatened to spread. The overseers had long eyes, the kind that searched for weakness and measured worth in bodies like coin. To them, Isaiah was worth less than a bent nail. He could not carry heavy loads without stumbling, could not hold the plough rope without trembling, could not climb the rough ladders to hang tobacco or cotton sacks without fear of falling. To men who demanded every back bent and every hand full, Isaiah was a waste of daylight. But as the drought tightened its grip, their eyes shifted from irritation to suspicion. It began with the plough. One morning, the largest ploughshare split clean down the iron, its edge shattered in the middle of the field. The mule driver swore he had seen Isaiah wandering near, his hands brushing the wooden handles, his pale skin catching the light. By the time the master was told, the story had shifted into certainty. Isaiah had touched the plough, and within an hour it had broken. It was foolishness, of course, but foolishness is easier to believe when fear is near at hand. Already the cotton had curled in the heat, already the stalks were stunted, and water buckets grew lighter with each passing day. A broken plough was no small thing. It was another stone sinking on the back of the harvest, another reminder that nature itself was turning against them, and when men search for a reason, they often reach for the nearest difference. Isaiah was that difference. The whispers spread quickly. That boy is a sign. The Lord marks him. He carries ill luck wherever he goes. Even among the enslaved, who bore their own suffering quietly, the words grew sharper. Some believed him touched, some believed him cursed, but few were willing to speak against the overseers when they repeated those words with conviction. Isaiah's mother tried to shield him from it, though her own fear was growing. She told him to stay close, to keep away from the fields where the men worked. But even in the safety of her arms he heard the muttering. At night, lying against her, he whispered, "Mama, why do they say my name like that?" Ruth had no answer she could give without breaking. She only hushed him and said, "They do not see the truth, Isaiah. You are my son. That is all that matters." Yet even she knew that on the plantation, truth did not matter. Belief mattered, and belief had already turned against him. The first time the overseer struck him, it was not for laziness, but for the way others looked when he walked by. Isaiah had been sent to fetch water, his trembling hands spilling half the bucket, when the overseer cuffed him hard enough to send him sprawling. The man spat into the dirt and muttered, "Better the boy be gone." It was not shouted, not ordered, but whispered just loud enough for others to hear. And in that moment, Isaiah's difference was no longer just a weakness. It had become a danger. Word of Isaiah's strangeness had travelled beyond the quarters. By the time the drought was biting at every acre, the master himself had heard enough murmurs to call for a physician. The man arrived from Charleston on a blistering morning, his carriage wheels caked with dust, his coat dark despite the heat. He stepped down with the air of authority, the kind that men cling to when the world no longer makes sense. If anyone could name what ailed Isaiah, it would be him, or so they believed. Isaiah was brought forward reluctantly, his mother's hand gripping his shoulder as though she could shield him from the weight of the doctor's eyes. The physician knelt to look closer, his fingers cold and firm as he turned the boy's chin, pushed back his lips, prodded the pale patches on his arms. The doctor's brows drew together, his expression shifting from curiosity to unease. He opened his bag, produced a small glass lens, and peered at Isaiah's skin as though magnification would reveal some hidden truth. But the truth did not come. He asked Isaiah to walk, to stretch his arms, to hold a stick. The boy's trembling worsened under the gaze of so many eyes. The doctor scribbled notes, shook his head, and muttered Latin words meant to sound like certainty. Yet when pressed for an answer, he gave none. "This child," he said at last, standing with a sigh, "is afflicted, though I cannot name the affliction. His condition does not match the pox, nor leprosy, nor any ailment recorded in my practice. It is anomalous." The word carried weight because it was unfamiliar. Anomalous. Unclassifiable. In a time when men believed every mark, every tremor, every fever had a place in God's design or man's science, the refusal of a name was as damning as a curse. The master frowned, demanding more. The overseers exchanged grim looks. The doctor only shook his head, closing his bag. "There is nothing to be done," he said. "Nothing to be cured. His ailment is beyond my knowledge." He left behind a few notes, lines of ink that named Isaiah not as a boy, but as a specimen, descriptions of his mottled skin, his weak frame, his trembling hands, cold words that stripped him of humanity. The doctor's carriage disappeared down the road by evening, and with it went the last hope of an explanation rooted in science. What remained was silence, heavy and suspicious. If a learned man could not define Isaiah, then perhaps there was no earthly explanation to be found. And when no earthly reason remains, people turn to heaven or to hell for their answers. That night, whispers curled through the quarters and the big house alike. The doctor cannot name it. Then it must be a sign. If the boy is beyond medicine, perhaps he is beyond nature itself. Ruth held Isaiah close as he slept fitfully, her tears dampening his hair. She knew the physician's failure had not protected her son. It had condemned him further. For the unknown is more dangerous than the known, and Isaiah had become the very shape of the unknown. The days stretched long and merciless, each one hotter than the last. Clouds passed high above, grey and swollen in the distance, but never broke over the fields of Carolina. The land cracked open wider, like parched lips begging for water. Cotton shriveled into brittle stalks, useless and dying where they stood. The wells, once shallow pools that gave life to the plantation, sank lower until the buckets scraped against mud. Animals grew restless, ribs showing sharp beneath their hides, tongues hanging in exhaustion. The drought had become more than a season. It was a presence, something felt in every cough, every empty stomach, every hushed prayer. And where suffering lingers, suspicion grows roots. By now, Isaiah's name was not whispered only in the quarters. It was spoken at the big house, in the meetings between the master and his overseers. The boy came, and the rain stopped, one man muttered. "He is touched," said another. The words were not shouted, but each repetition gave them strength, like embers feeding a fire. Isaiah himself felt the shift in every glance that slid across him. When he walked near the fields, men turned their backs. Women pulled their children closer, as though his very shadow could cling to them. The other children no longer taunted him aloud. Instead they pointed, their laughter uneasy, their games interrupted when he came too close. Even silence was heavy, weighted with blame. One afternoon, as Isaiah carried a bucket of water toward the quarters, he stumbled, his trembling hands spilling most of it into the dirt. The dry ground drank it instantly, leaving nothing. A woman gasped, clutching her chest as though he had wasted more than water. "The boy cannot even hold life," she muttered, and those nearby nodded grimly, as if he had confirmed what they already believed. Ruth tried to shield him from it all, but even she could not keep out the venom. She scolded those who spoke ill, yet her voice trembled, betraying the fear she carried. At night she told Isaiah that people spoke from hunger, from suffering, not from truth. But the boy had eyes, and he saw how even she now flinched when he shook too violently, or when the pale marks on his skin caught the moonlight. And still, the sky refused to break. Day after day, the heavens remained sealed, as though some unseen hand held them shut. The sermons in town grew harsher, preachers warning of sins unrepented, of curses unbroken. The congregation nodded, some stealing glances at Isaiah's family, as though the preacher's words had been meant for them alone. By the end of the month, it was no longer only whispered that Isaiah carried a curse. It was spoken plainly with certainty, as if proven fact. A plough had broken, a mule had collapsed, a barn had burned, and always someone remembered the boy nearby. Misfortune had become his shadow. The drought had become his crime. And though no evidence tied him to the sun that withheld its rain, the plantation had already chosen its scapegoat. The town church stood at the crossroads, its whitewashed boards peeling in the heat, its steeple pointing skyward like an accusing finger. On Sundays, the pews filled with planters, merchants, and overseers, their collars stiff, their Bibles heavy in their hands. The enslaved were herded to the back, standing room only, eyes lowered as though reverence could shield them from judgment. The drought had made every sermon sharper, every prayer more desperate. When crops failed and bellies ached, men looked to heaven for explanations. And when explanations did not come, they searched for signs. That morning, the preacher's voice cracked like thunder across the still air. He spoke of sin that brings punishment, of hidden wickedness that draws down God's wrath. He spoke of curses that walk in human form, of plagues that arrive as warnings. "The Lord marks those he wishes to use as lessons," he shouted, sweat dripping down his brow. "When the land suffers, it is not without reason. When the heavens close, it is not without cause." Every word seemed to hang longer in the air than the last, like smoke from a fire that refused to burn out. The congregation nodded, murmurs rising, heads turning not toward the preacher, but toward the backs of the pews. Eyes lingered on the dark faces there, eyes searching for the mark of sin. Some did not stop searching until they found Isaiah's pale patches of skin, standing out against the dim light. His mother's hand gripped his tightly, but it did little to steady him. He could feel the weight of those eyes, heavier than any chain. To them, his very body was an answer to the preacher's question, a living example of God's displeasure. He looked down at the floorboards, but the stairs did not ease. By the time the service ended, whispers carried through the congregation like a river breaking its banks. The preacher spoke truth. The land is cursed because of sin, because of something among us. That boy. He carries the mark. The overseers left with grim faces, their boots striking hard against the wooden steps. The master remained silent, but his silence spoke more than words. He had heard what the congregation believed, and belief was a dangerous thing when joined with hunger. On the walk back to the plantation, Isaiah's mother tried to shield him with her body, keeping him close against her hip, but whispers followed them even down the dirt road, carried by neighbors and strangers alike. The preacher had not named him, but he had not needed to. The people had done it themselves. Isaiah was the lesson, the warning, the vessel for blame. That night, when the air hung thick and heavy with dust, Ruth rocked Isaiah in her arms and told him to forget the words he had heard. But the boy, though small, understood. He understood in the way children sense danger before they can name it. He did not cry. He only asked her, in a voice as fragile as the dry leaves outside, "Mama, why does God not want me?" The night was heavy with stillness, the kind of silence that presses against the chest and makes every sound sharper. Crickets sang weakly in the weeds, but even their music seemed thin in the drought. The barns, filled with dry husks of hay and brittle wood, stood like tinder waiting for a spark. It came without warning. Sometime past midnight, flames burst into the darkness, climbing high and fast, painting the sky in shades of red. The fire tore through the first barn as if it had waited for the chance, hay igniting like powder, smoke rolling out in choking waves. Men rushed from their quarters, shouting, forming frantic lines with buckets that held more dust than water. The wells were too shallow, the buckets too small. The flames laughed at their efforts. By the time dawn broke, one barn had collapsed entirely, and another leaned blackened, its timbers smouldering like bones in ash. No one knew how it had started. Some said lightning, though the skies had been clear. Others claimed a spark from a lantern left too close to hay. But the explanation mattered less than the story they chose to tell, and by sunrise, Isaiah's name was already on their lips. Children whispered first, voices hushed but sharp. He was near the barn yesterday. He was staring at it. Then grown men added weight. I saw him walking past before dark. He looked at the boards like he was counting them. Small scraps of memory were twisted, reshaped into evidence. By noon, the whispers had hardened into certainty. The cursed boy had willed the fire. Isaiah felt the eyes on him when he stepped outside, felt them burn hotter than the flames had. He tried to stay near his mother, but even she could not shield him from the glares. Mothers pulled their children back when he passed. Men muttered openly now, no longer needing to lower their voices. The word curse rolled easily from their tongues, as natural as breathing. The overseer, his face darkened with soot and fury, struck Isaiah across the shoulder that morning, shouting that his stare was poison. "Wherever you walk, boy, trouble follows," he snarled, his spit catching the dust. Isaiah did not understand. His trembling hands clutched at the earth, and he could only cry into his mother's dress as she shielded him, daring the man to raise his hand again. But even Ruth could feel the tide shifting. One fire could be misfortune, two, perhaps coincidence. But in the hearts of desperate people, each disaster stacked upon the last, building a wall of certainty. The broken plough, the dead mule, the withering crops, and now the fire, all of it had become Isaiah's story in their minds. That night, as the embers still smouldered and the air reeked of ash, Ruth whispered to Isaiah that the world had turned its back on reason. "You are not the fire," she told him, her voice breaking. But he heard her words falter, and in the silence that followed, he wondered if even she believed it anymore. After the fire, the line between Isaiah and the rest of the plantation grew sharper, as if scorched into the ground itself. Where once children had teased him at a distance, now they did not come near at all. Mothers pulled them back with sharp tugs when he wandered close, whispering warnings into their ears. Do not touch him. Do not speak to him. It was as though his very shadow had become a contagion. In the quarters, The distance grew colder. When Isaiah entered a doorway, conversation faltered. When he passed a fire, men turned their shoulders, pretending he was not there. Even among his own people, those who shared his chains and his hunger, he found no welcome. They too carried fear, and fear has little room for mercy. Ruth fought against it, holding his hand tighter, forcing him to sit beside her at meals, daring others to object. But even she could not undo the way glances slipped toward him in the half-dark, eyes filled with suspicion, lips muttering words she could not always hear. She told herself it was only talk, but deep down she felt the danger in it. Talk was the first step before action. Isaiah felt the silence more than the words. In the daylight, he lingered on the edges of the quarters, tracing lines in the dirt with trembling fingers. He spoke less, for each word he gave seemed to hang too heavily in the air. He learned to make himself small, to fold his shoulders in, to avoid meeting eyes that only looked at him with dread. A boy of 8 or 9 should have been chasing laughter, but Isaiah was already learning to shrink into the shadows. At night, when the quarters were filled with the sound of breathing, Ruth would rock him and tell him he was not alone. She whispered that he was loved, that he was meant for more than their cruel world would allow. Yet even her words could not reach the hollowness inside him. The other children slept side by side, eyed curled together for comfort. Isaiah lay pressed against his mother, but in his heart he was already set apart. The overseers encouraged the distance. They saw the way people avoided him, and they fed it with quiet nods, with sly remarks. "Best keep the boy apart," one said. "Nothing good comes near him." Such words carried authority, and the others followed without question. It was easier to blame a child than to face the weight of a drought that stretched on with no end. Isaiah noticed, too, how the master's eyes lingered on him when he was brought near the big house. It was not the glance of a man seeing a child. It was the look one gives an animal that does not behave, a problem yet unsolved. In those moments, Isaiah felt the truth more deeply than any whisper. He was no longer seen as a boy. He was something else, something apart, something feared. And once a person is no longer seen as human, what follows is rarely mercy. By midsummer, the drought was no longer just a hardship. It was a sentence. The fields stood brittle and bare, rows of cotton no higher than a man's knee, their leaves curled like clenched fists. The wells offered little more than mud at the bottom of their throats. Livestock collapsed in the heat, their carcasses left to rot where they fell because no one had the strength to drag them away. Hunger clawed at every belly. Hope had thinned like the cracked soil beneath their feet. It was during these weeks that Isaiah's name grew heavier, spoken not only in whispers but in the hard voices of the overseers. Around the table in the big house, their words sharpened into warnings. "That boy brings nothing but trouble," one said. "Every disaster, every loss, his shadow is there." Another leaned forward, voice low, but certain. "Sell him off before the whole place goes to ruin. Better yet, rid us of him for good. The land won't see rain until he's gone." The master sat stiff, lips pressed tight, listening but not deciding. He had the face of a man torn between the comfort of reason and the pressure of fear. But reason in those days was a frail thing. Every broken tool, every dead animal, every cracked well tipped the scales toward superstition, and the overseers knew it. They pressed harder with each passing day, their voices rising with hunger and resentment. In the quarters, the talk was no different. Some said Isaiah should be sent away, far from the fields. Others whispered he should be hidden in the woods, left for the Lord to decide. A few, their patience ground down to dust, muttered words Ruth dared not repeat. That the boy should not see another sunrise. Isaiah overheard more than his mother wished. Children's ears are sharpest when danger is near. He sat in the corner of the quarters one night, his knees pulled to his chest, while the men argued in low voices about curses and calamity. He heard his name again and again, tied not to laughter, not to childhood, but to ruin. He buried his face in his arms, trembling not from his ailment, but from the fear that grew louder than the cicadas outside. Ruth tried to fight for him. She stood before the overseers when they sneered at her boy, her voice steady even as her hands shook. "He is only a child," she said. "He is no curse. He is flesh and blood, like your own sons." But her words fell again, Saint Stone. The men had already chosen what to believe, and belief once rooted is harder to tear from the ground than any crop. The sky above remained cruelly blank, no clouds to soften its endless blue. Each morning began with the same dry wind, each evening ended with the same cracked earth. And each day, Isaiah's place on the plantation grew more precarious. Hunger had a way of stripping away compassion. Desperation had a way of demanding a sacrifice, and in the eyes of the overseers, the boy had already been chosen. Word of the worsening drought, of the dead animals and failing crops, spread far beyond the plantation. In desperation, the master sent once more for the physician from Charleston, believing perhaps that science could yet give a name to Isaiah's strangeness, something that would quiet the whispers and still the talk of curses. If the doctor could place the boy's condition neatly into a ledger, then perhaps the plantation might find reason again. The doctor arrived in a heat that made the air shimmer. His face was already weary, his shirt damp with sweat before he even stepped inside. He found Isaiah sitting quietly in the corner of the quarters, Ruth's hand resting protectively on his shoulder. The boy did not flinch when the physician approached. He only looked up with those wide eyes that seemed too old for his small frame, eyes that carried the weight of everyone else's fear. Once again the doctor prodded and measured. He pressed against Isaiah's chest, listening to the uneven rhythm of his heart. He lifted the boy's arms, watching the tremors ripple through his muscles. He examined the pale patches of skin, some spread wider now under the summer sun, others faint, as if retreating into shadow. The physician muttered notes in his book, his pen scratching nervously, each line written with more hesitation than the last. After an hour, he closed his instruments with a sigh. The overseers, gathered nearby, demanded answers. The master himself stood rigid, waiting for a word that could calm the fear rotting his land. But the doctor shook his head. "This condition," he said slowly, "is beyond my study. It is not fever. It is not pox, nor leprosy, nor any affliction known to me. The skin may change without cause, the muscles may shake, but I cannot say why. It may be some defect of birth, or some mark that cannot be erased." The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. He had not said curse, but he might as well have. His ignorance gave shape to the superstition already growing wild. The master pressed further. "Is it contagious? Will it spread?" "No," the doctor admitted, reluctant. "I believe it harms no one but the boy himself, but it cannot be named, it cannot be treated, and what cannot be explained." His words trailed off, but the overseers finished them in their minds. By the time the doctor rode away that evening, his ledger heavier but no wiser, the damage had been done. His failure had not brought relief, it had hardened belief. Science had no name for Isaiah, medicine had no cure, and in the 19th century, when knowledge faltered, fear rushed in to fill the silence. That night, as smoke from the burned barn still lingered faint in the air, the men spoke plainly. If the doctor cannot save us from the boy, then perhaps only God, or Phi, can. Ruth held Isaiah close, whispering that he was no curse, but she too had seen the look in their eyes. It was no longer doubt. It was decision. The summer pressed on, thick and airless, until even the nights gave no relief. The heat clung to the walls of the quarters, and the air smelled of sweat, dust, and despair. It was during those nights that Isaiah began to shake more violently. His body, already frail, grew restless in ways that frightened even his mother. Sleep no longer came as quiet rest. It came as torment. Isaiah would thrash in the dark, his thin arms striking out, his legs trembling as though running from something only he could see. Sometimes he cried out in a voice that did not sound like his own, hoarse and broken, echoing through the silence of the quarters. At other times, he muttered words too soft to understand, fragments that seemed to scrape against the edges of sense, half prayers, half pleas, sometimes just sounds that carried no meaning but all the weight of anguish. The other children woke with wide eyes, clutching their mothers. They whispered that Isaiah spoke in tongues, that the fever had opened his mouth for something else to speak through him. Some swore they saw his eyes glow in the firelight, though it was nothing more than the reflection of embers. Still, the stories grew sharper with each night. "He is not right," one woman whispered. "The devil lays his hand on him." Another crossed herself and muttered, "He dreams the dreams of the cursed." Ruth tried to quiet him, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, rocking him as though he were still the infant she had once cradled. She prayed aloud, words of scripture tumbling through her cracked voice, not for herself, but to drown out the whispers around her. "He is only sick," she told them. "The fever grips him, nothing more." But in the faces of her neighbors, she saw doubt turn to fear, fear into certainty. The overseers, hearing the reports, only added fuel. They laughed bitterly at the talk of possession, but in their laughter there was no dismissal. It was the laughter of men who already believed and only enjoyed the way terror spread. "A cursed child crying in the night," one sneered. "The land will not heal until he is gone." Their words carried weight, heavier than Ruth's prayers. Isaiah himself could not remember the dreams when morning came. He woke exhausted, his throat raw, his small body drenched in sweat. He clung to his mother's arm, asking only, "What did I do, Mama? Why do they look at me like that?" She hushed him, but the truth clawed at her heart. No matter what she said, no matter how fiercely she loved him, the world around them had already made its decision. Night after night, the cries continued. Each time the tale grew. Isaiah spoke with spirits. Isaiah called down misfortune. Isaiah's screams shook the rafters. None of it was true, yet none of it need, dead to be. On a land drowning in drought and despair, the truth mattered less than the story. And the story had already chosen Isaiah as its monster. The war had turned the countryside into a restless corridor, soldiers drifting through like storms, leaving ruin in their wake. One evening, just as the sun sagged low, a column of men in tattered grey uniforms appeared at the edge of the fields. Their boots kicked up dust, their rifles slung across shoulders, their faces hollow with hunger. They were not here to fight. They were here to take. The master stepped from the porch to meet them, his voice sharp but his hands trembling. Soldiers did not ask. They demanded. Chickens were seized by the neck, carried off squawking. Smokehouses were stripped of salted meat. Barrels of cornmeal were rolled onto wagons. Even the few mules left alive were led away by rope, their hooves dragging as if they too understood what was being stolen. The overseers stood powerless, their whips useless against men with rifles. From the quarters, families watched in silence, their faces caught between fear and fury. This was not their food being taken, not their animals, yet they knew they would feel the loss. Hunger did not care whose name was on the smokehouse door. Hunger came for everyone. By the time the soldiers left, the plantation felt hollow. The night came quiet, too quiet, with bellies emptier than before. Men muttered angrily in the dark, their voices thick with resentment, and as always, when resentment needed a target, Isaiah's name was near at hand. They came because of him, one man whispered. "The curse draws misfortune like flies to rot." Another added, "First the drought, now soldiers. What's next? The plague?" It did not matter that soldiers marched where they pleased, that hunger was swallowing the whole South. It did not matter that Isaiah was only a boy, curled against his mother in fear as the rifles gleamed. The story was easier when his name carried the blame. Isaiah overheard them. He always did. He heard the way men spat his name, the way women clutched their children tighter when he passed. He did not understand why misfortune followed him, only that people believed it did. In his small heart, guilt began to grow where no guilt belonged. He asked his mother, in a voice fragile as the wind, "Mama, if I go away, will the rain come back?" Ruth's chest broke with the question. She pulled him close, holding his trembling body, and whispered, "No, my boy. You are not the drought. You are not the reason." Yet her words, though fierce, shook as they left her lips. He felt it, and the doubt in her voice cut deeper than the whispers outside. By the next day, the story had hardened. The soldier's theft was spoken of as another mark of Isaiah's curse. It was no longer coincidence, no longer misfortune. In the minds of the overseers, and even some of the enslaved, it was proof. The land would not heal until the boy was gone. The fever came quietly at first, like a whisper on the wind. A child coughed in the night, another burned with heat by morning. By the end of the week, it had spread through the quarters like fire through dry grass. Mothers pressed damp cloths to their children's foreheads, whispered prayers into ears too hot to hear, and watched helplessly as small bodies trembled under the weight of sickness. The fever showed no mercy. Strong boys who had carried water in the fields were reduced to shaking shadows. Little girls who had laughed in circles now lay silent, their breaths ragged, their eyes glazed. Some never woke again. Their cries faded, replaced by the sound of weeping mothers, the hollow wails that carried across the fields at night. Isaiah too fell sick. His skin burned, his body shook harder than ever before, and his mother feared each hour would be his last. She stayed by his side, holding him against her chest, whispering hymns with a voice cracked from exhaustion. She begged the Lord to spare him, begged for just one kindness in a world that had given so little. And then, as days passed, Isaiah's fever broke. His breathing steadied, his skin cooled. While others were carried out to shallow graves dug in the far field, Isaiah lived. He rose weak, thin as a reed, but he rose. His mother thanked heaven with tears, pressing her lips to his brow. For her it was salvation. For others, it was proof of something darker. "He lives when others die," one woman muttered bitterly, her eyes red from mourning her daughter. "He draws the life from them." Another spat in the dust and said, "No sickness dares take him, for he brings it with him." The overseers listened, their faces grim. They did not speak of medicine, for they knew little of it. They did not speak of coincidence, for coincidence gave no comfort. Instead they nodded, as though the deaths confirmed what they had long suspected. The boy did not fall because the curse shielded him, and if the curse shielded him, then it destroyed those around him. Isaiah felt the weight of those stares as he stumbled back into the daylight, still fragile, still trembling. He saw the way the other children shrank from him, the way even grieving mothers pulled the living closer when he passed. He wanted to cry out, to say he had done nothing, that he too had felt the fire in his veins. But his voice failed him, and the silence spoke louder than words. That night, as another funeral fire burned in the far field, Ruth rocked him and whispered that his survival was not a curse, but a blessing. Yet her voice was drowned by the wails of mothers who had lost their children. To them, blessings and curses were one and the same, measured only by who lived and who did not. And Isaiah, alive when so many were gone, was no longer seen as a child at all. He was the explanation their grief demanded. The fever had passed, but its shadow lingered. Fresh graves dotted the far edge of the plantation, marked only by stones and silence. Mothers wept quietly at night, their grief folded into the rhythm of work by day. And through that grief, Isaiah's name was spoken with sharper edges than ever before. He had lived, while so many others had not. To some, that survival was unnatural. To others, it was proof that the curse clung tighter than any sickness. The overseers Pishahi rest their case harder now. "The boy cannot stay among the others," one said, his voice low but firm. "Each day he brings misfortune closer. The children fear him. The mothers blame him. He must be set apart, or worse." The master, weary from drought, theft, and now death, rubbed his temples as though the decision itself were another burden laid upon him. He was not a man of science, nor of mercy. He was a man of land, of crops, of labor. And when men like him weighed a life, it was not in years or in hopes. It was in bushels of cotton, in pounds of meat, in the ease or unrest of those who worked the soil. Isaiah brought unrest, and unrest cost more than it gave. So the order was given. The boy would no longer sleep in the quarters. He would be moved to the old shed at the edge of the fields, a place once used for tools and now empty, its roof sagging, its boards warped from years of sun and rain. Ruth begged on her knees, clutching the hem of the master's coat, tears streaking down her face. "He is only a child," she cried. "He is my child. Do not send him away." But her words were brushed aside like dust. The overseer dragged her back by the shoulders as Isaiah watched, his wide eyes fixed not on them, but on the shed waiting across the field. That night, with only the stars watching, Isaiah was led to his new place. The shed smelled of mold and old wood, the floor littered with straw and broken tools. A thin blanket was thrown inside, and the door was left ajar, though everyone knew the message was clear. He was no longer part of the others. He was to live alone. Ruth came when she could, slipping through shadows to bring him scraps of bread or a cup of water. She held him close in the dark, whispering that he was not cursed, that he was only her boy, that the world was cruel, but not God. Yet each time she left, Isaiah felt the walls close in tighter, the silence heavier. From the quarters, the children sometimes crept to the edge of the fields, daring one another to peer at the shed. They never entered, never called his name, but their laughter carried back, sharp and cruel, as though his isolation were part of some game. Isaiah lay awake listening, his chest aching not from fever, but from the kind of loneliness that makes the heart tremble worse than the hands. The shed was meant to contain him, to set him apart. But in truth it became something worse. It became a symbol, and symbols once created are far harder to destroy than any wall of wood. Life in the shed was not life at all, but a half-existence, measured not in days but in silences. The old boards creaked with every breeze. The roof leaked when storms threatened, though rain rarely came, and the air inside carried the smell of mildew and dust. Isaiah slept on straw that pricked his skin, his thin blanket clutched tight around him even in the summer heat. Each morning, the sounds of work carried from the fields, voices rising and falling, the crack of whips splitting the air. But none of those sounds called for him. He was forgotten, yet never fully gone. Children dared one another to creep close to the shed, whispering stories about the boy inside. Some swore that if you looked through the crack in the boards at night, his eyes glowed like embers. Others claimed his shadow moved even when he sat still. They laughed as they ran back to the quarters, but the laughter was nervous, edged with fear. To them, Isaiah was no longer a playmate or even a child. He had become a tale to frighten one another, a ghost in flesh. Adults avoided the path near the shed altogether. When they carried water from the well or tools from the barn, they took longer routes rather than pass too close. To see him sitting there, pale patches showing in the sun, trembling hands resting on his knees, was to be reminded of all the things that could not be explained. And people did not like reminders. Better to walk further, better to act as though he did not exist. Ruth was the only one who broke the silence. She came when darkness fell, slipping across the fields with scraps of food hidden in her apron. She sat beside him on the straw, her rough hands smoothing his hair, her voice soft, though her heart broke with every visit. "You are mine," she whispered. "You are not the curse they say. Do you hear me, Isaiah? You are mine." He nodded, but his eyes were distant, fixed on the cracks in the roof where starlight slipped through. Sometimes he asked her questions she could not answer. "Mama, why don't they want me?" "Mama, if I go away, will the rain come back?" Each question pressed against her like a knife. She answered as best she could, telling him he was loved, that he was no curse. But her voice trembled, and he felt the tremor. Even a child can hear when hope is fading. The nights were the hardest. Alone in the shed, Isaiah listened to the scurrying of mice, the sigh of the wind across the empty fields. He heard the distant laughter of other children and felt the ache of being apart, of knowing their games no longer had space for him. Loneliness pressed close, a weight heavier than chains, and in the silence, he began to wonder if perhaps the whispers were right. If misfortune always followed him, maybe it was because he carried it inside. The shed was meant to keep Isaiah away from the others, but what it truly did was teach him to see himself as the thing they feared. And once a child begins to believe the lies spoken about him, the cruelty of the world has already won. The land gave no mercy. Each day the sun beat down heavier, the air thick with dust that coated throats and made every breath taste of earth. The wells had always been the plantation's lifeline, narrow shafts dug deep into the ground where cool water once gathered. But in the drought, those wells grew shallow, their ropes dragging up more mud than drink. Men worked desperately to dig them deeper, their tools striking stone, their hands blistered and raw. It was on one such day that the accident came. A man was lowered into the shaft with a rope, his body swallowed by the darkness below. Voices called down, the rope strained, and then, with a groan of earth and wood, the walls shuddered. In an instant, the well collapsed, a roar of dirt and stone tumbling inward. Men shouted, scrambling to pull the rope, but it was too late. The worker was buried beneath the weight of the earth, his cries muffled, then gone. Silence followed, broken only by the echo of shovels digging in vain. The plantation mourned another loss, but grief quickly gave way to whispers. Isaiah had been seen earlier that morning, standing near the path to the well, his thin frame silhouetted against the light. Some said he had paused to stare down into the shaft, his pale patches catching the sun. Others swore they had heard him muttering to himself, though it was only the soft hum of a lonely child. By sundown, the story had twisted into certainty. Isaiah had looked into the well, and the well had swallowed a man. The overseers spoke harshly now, their patience worn to the bone. "Everywhere this boy walks, death follows," one spat, his voice cutting through the hot air. "Tools break, barns burn, children die, and now a man crushed in the earth. How many signs must we suffer before the Master sees truth?" Ruth pleaded again, her voice hoarse from too many nights of prayer and too many days of begging. "He is only a child. Misfortune is not his doing. The land is sick, not him." But her words, though fierce, faltered against the weight of belief. Belief does not bend to reason, especially when reason has failed to bring rain. Isaiah heard it all. From his shed he watched the men pass, their eyes hard, their mouths spitting his name like poison. He pressed his trembling hands to his ears, but it did not silence them. The voices carried in the wind, circling him, binding him tighter than the boards of his prison. He did not understand why every disaster was his burden, only that it was. That night, the plantation gathered in weary silence. The drought had taken crops, animals, children, and now a man, and still the skies remained empty. The firelight flickered across tired faces, each one drawn and desperate. And somewhere in the crowd, a voice spoke the words many had already thought. Until the boy is gone, the land will never be healed. The words spread like sparks, and Isaiah, sitting alone in the darkness of the shed, felt their heat even before the fire was lit. Ruth came to him at night, when the overseer's boots were quiet, and the quarters had fallen into uneasy sleep. She moved like a shadow across the fields, carrying scraps hidden in her apron, half a crust of bread, a few spoonfuls of beans, a cup of water she had saved from her own share. To bring him these things was a risk, but to do nothing would have been worse. He was her son, her only light in a world made of chains and silence. Inside the shed, she would sit with him on the straw, smoothing his hair with rough hands that had pulled weeds and carried burdens all her life. She whispered words meant to soothe, meant to remind him that he was still a boy and not the curse others claimed. But Isaiah's eyes, wide and weary, searched hers with questions that no comfort could erase. "Mama," he asked one night, his voice barely a thread, "why don't they want me?" Her chest tightened. She told him they were afraid, that fear made people cruel, that it was not his fault. But he shook his head, pale patches catching the moonlight through, or the cracks in the roof. "They say I bring bad things. They say the land won't live because of me. Is it true?" She pulled him close, holding his trembling body against her own. "No, Isaiah. You are not the drought. You are not the fire. You are not the sickness. You are my child. That is the only truth." Still, he pressed on. "If I went away, would the rain come back?" The innocence of the question broke her more than the words themselves. He did not yet see his life as a life. He saw himself as a burden to be removed, a shadow to be lifted so the sun might return. Ruth swallowed her tears, forcing her voice steady. "The rain will come when the Lord wills it, not because of you. Do you hear me, Isaiah? Not because of you." Yet inside, a terrible fear gnawed at her. She wondered how long she could hold him against the weight of everyone else's belief. Her arms were strong, but the tide of a whole plantation was stronger still. Sometimes Isaiah told her of his dreams. He spoke of walking through empty fields where the cotton was ash, where the sky burned red, and where he was alone, always alone. He dreamed of voices calling him, "Curse, curse, curse," until he woke, trembling and choking back cries. She rocked him until he quieted, but his words lingered with her even after she left the shed. Each night when she crept back to the quarters, Ruth felt the eyes of others watching, even in the dark. Some looked at her with pity, others with contempt. But none spoke a word. Their silence was worse than curses. It was the silence of people who had already made their choice. And as Isaiah lay awake in the shed, staring at the cracks of moonlight above him, he began to believe that choice. He was no longer certain he was simply a boy. He feared he was exactly what they named him, a curse bound in trembling flesh. By late summer, the fields were nearly lost. Cotton stalks stood like skeletons, brittle and grey. The air shimmered with heat, the sky a pitiless blue without a single cloud to offer hope. Hunger gnawed at every belly, and the anger that comes with hunger turned sharper with each passing day. It was in this season of desperation that the overseers demanded a meeting with the master. They gathered in the big house, its shutters drawn against the heat, the air inside heavy with the smell of sweat and stale tobacco. The master sat at the head of the table, his face worn from weeks of loss, his patience thinning. Around him stood 3 overseers, their voices low but urgent, their eyes hard with certainty. "This cannot go on," one began. "The land has been cursed since the day that boy came into it. We've lost the barn, the plough, the children, now a man buried in the well, and still the skies are dry." Another leaned forward, his fist on the table. "He is no ordinary child. Even the doctor said so. He named no illness, no cure. If science cannot explain him, then perhaps he is not meant to be explained." The master said nothing at first, his gaze fixed on the glass of whiskey before him. He had never been a man to bend to superstition easily, but superstition had a way of pressing in when reason failed. The plantation was dying under his watch, and men dead an answer. His wealth, his pride, his very standing among neighbors, all of it was shrinking with the parched earth, and Isaiah had become the vessel for every misfortune. "What do you propose?" he asked finally, his voice rough. The first overseer did not hesitate. "Sell him. Send him away before the rains will return. Let another man bear the curse." The second shook his head. "No one will take him. Word has spread. Even if someone bought him, he would only bring their ruin. Better to end it here. Better to rid ourselves of him entirely." The third, quieter than the others, spoke with a calculating tone. "Lock him away. Keep him where he cannot touch the fields or the people. Let him waste in that shed until the land heals. It is not the boy we need. It is the end of the curse." The master sat back, weighing their words. He was not a man of sentiment. Isaiah was no prophet, no worker, no asset. He was a liability. Still, to kill a child outright carried its own risks, even in a world where mercy was rare. The decision was made in silence, but when the master finally spoke, it was with cold resolve. "He stays in the shed," he said. "No work, no play, no freedom. Let him be apart until the rains return. If they do not, we will reconsider." The overseers nodded, satisfied. They had pressed their case and won. That night Ruth wept quietly, her cries muffled in her hands. For she knew the truth. The decision was not mercy. It was a sentence delayed, and each day that passed would bring them closer to the end they feared to name. The shed grew smaller with each passing day, its warped boards pressing in like a coffin around Isaiah's thin frame. The air inside was heavy, stale with mold, and each breath scraped his throat raw. His trembling, once only in his hands, had spread through his whole body. He grew weaker, his legs unsteady, his steps dragging like weights. Hunger carved hollows into his cheeks, and his eyes, those wide, searching eyes, seemed to sink deeper with every sunrise. Ruth saw the change each night she came. She carried what scraps she could steal: bread crusts, a spoonful of beans, a handful of corn. But it was never enough. She cupped his face in her hands, felt the fever beneath his skin, and whispered that he would be all right. Yet the words faltered as she spoke them. Her sun was fading, and she could do nothing but watch. "Why won't they let me come back, Mama?" Isaiah asked one night, his voice no louder than the crickets outside. "I can help. I can carry water. I can pick cotton." He tried to smile, but his lips cracked in the attempt. Ruth pulled him close, rocking him as she had when he was an infant, her tears dampening his hair. She could not tell him the truth, that to the others, his very breath was poison. Outside the plantation, whispers had begun to spread. In the nearby town, at the market stalls and in the pews, people spoke of the cursed boy in Carolina. They said a child had been born with skin marked by God, a child who carried famine in his shadow. They said barns burned when he looked upon them, wells caved at his feet, and children sickened if he came near. No one spoke. Okay, Isaiah's name, but everyone knew the story. The demon child of the plantation became a tale told in hushed voices, a warning carried from mouth to mouth. The overseers fueled the rumors, their pride wounded by their own helplessness. "We dig and sweat, and still the land dies," one muttered at the tavern. "But it's no mystery. The boy draws the life out of everything he touches." Men leaned in, listening, nodding, and the story grew darker with every telling. By the time it circled back to the plantation, Isaiah was no longer just a curse. He was a threat, a danger to be feared, a weight too heavy for the land to bear. Ruth felt the tide rising, and terror gripped her heart. Each day she returned to the shed. She expected to find it empty, her son taken in the night by men who had whispered too long about his end. She prayed louder, longer, clutching Isaiah in her arms as if her body alone could shield him. But prayers could not turn the earth green, could not fill the wells, could not soften hearts already hardened by hunger. Isaiah grew quieter, his strength ebbing. He watched his mother with hollow eyes, still searching for answers she could not give. And outside, the world whispered louder, as if waiting for the moment when the boy would no longer draw breath, and with him the drought would break. By the end of that summer, the land was no longer merely dry. It was broken. Dust rose with every step, clinging to skin, choking the lungs, coating food and water alike. The sun hung heavy and merciless, a white eye that never closed, its heat pressing down like the hand of a cruel god. Cotton fields lay barren, their stalks withered into brittle sticks that rattled when the wind passed. The ground cracked in jagged lines deep enough to swallow a man's foot, and even the strongest animals lay collapsed in the shade, their ribs sharp beneath their hides. The plantation was starving. Children's bellies swelled with hunger, their cries sharp in the night. Mothers had no milk left to give. Men stumbled through their work with hollow eyes, sweat pouring down backs that had long since lost the strength to endure. The overseers barked orders, but even their voices had grown ragged, the authority drained from them by thirst. And still, the rain did not come. When the sky is empty, men search the earth for someone to blame. Isaiah had long been the whisper, but now he became the certainty. "The drought will not break while he draws breath," one overseer muttered, his voice carrying across the field. Another spat into the dust and said, "He is the chain around all our necks. The boy must be gone." These words, once spoken in corners, now echoed openly, unchallenged. Isaiah felt it in every glance. From the cracks of his shed, he watched people pass, their eyes avoiding him yet full of something sharper than fear. It was resentment, the kind that grows in empty bellies, the kind that demands a sacrifice. Even the other children, gaunt and weary, stared at him with a mixture of terror and fury, as though he had stolen the food from their mouths. At night, Ruth held him as he trembled in her arms, but even her comfort was fraying. She prayed aloud, desperate words tumbling into the silence. "Lord, break the sky, send the rain, spare my boy." But each prayer ended in sobs she tried to hide, for she knew what others planned. The drought had become unbearable, and unbearable things demand answers. The master, pacing in his house, no longer dismissed the overseer's talk. His profits were gone, his neighbors whispered of ruin, and his pride could not bear another season of loss. He looked out across the dead fields and thought of Isaiah, the child with trembling hands and pale patches, the child no doctor could name. In the master's mind, Isaiah was no longer a boy. He was a weight, and weights are meant to be lifted, cast off, discarded. The plantation waited, restless and hungry. Each dry wind seemed to whisper the same thought. The boy is the curse, The boy's the drought. The boy must be sacrificed. And Isaiah, lying weak in the straw, felt that whisper pressing closer, heavier, as though the land itself had joined the chorus calling for his end. Isaiah's strength faded like the last embers of a fire, each day weaker than the one before. His hands, once trembling, now could barely lift the crust of bread his mother smuggled to him. His breath came shallow, his voice a whisper so faint Ruth had to lean close to hear. The boy who had once asked questions, who had once looked at her with wide, searching eyes, now stared at the boards above him with a stillness that frightened her more than any scream. Ruth knelt beside him, rocking him gently, as though her arms alone could anchor him to the world. She whispered scripture through her tears, begged him to hold on, begged him to believe he was not what they said. But Isaiah only asked one question, over and over, his voice trembling. "Mama, why does God not want me?" She answered as she always had, that he was not cursed, that he was her blessing. But even as the words left her lips, she felt them falter. For every time she returned to the quarters, she heard the overseer's voices growing louder. "They will not wait much longer," she told herself in the dark. "They will not let him live until the rains come." She knew what desperation does to men. Hunger and fear do not reason. They demand a sacrifice. And her son, her Isaiah, had already been chosen. One evening, as the sun sank like molten iron, Ruth made her way across the fields with trembling hands. She carried more food than usual, saving from her own mouth, her own strength. She planned to take Isaiah and flee, to slip into the woods and follow the river north until the night swallowed them. But when she reached the shed, she found him too weak to rise. His body lay curled in the straw, his skin hot with fever, his eyes half closed. She tried to lift him, to coax him onto his feet, but his legs buckled beneath him. "Hold on, my boy," she whispered, her tears wetting his brow. "I will find a way. I will not leave." "Are you here?" But before she could gather her courage, before she could try again, heavy footsteps approached. The overseers stood in the doorway, their shadows long against the fading light. Their faces were carved from stone, their eyes cold with the certainty of men who believed they were delivering justice. One carried a rope coiled at his side, another a shovel. Ruth rose to shield Isaiah, her arms spread wide, her body trembling but unyielding. "He is only a child," she cried, her voice raw. "He is my child. You will not touch him." But the overseers did not flinch. Hunger had hardened them. Fear had blinded them. They saw not a boy, not a mother's desperate love, but the curse they believed had starved their land. The night held its breath as Ruth stood between them and her son, knowing the moment she feared had finally come. That night, the world seemed to hold its silence. The air was thick, the crickets quiet, the fields still as if waiting for something final. Inside the shed, Isaiah lay curled in the straw, his eyes half closed, his chest rising with shallow breaths. Ruth knelt over him, her arms wrapped tight, her body a barrier between him and the men who had gathered outside. The overseers did not shout, they did not curse. Their footsteps and the creak of the door were enough. One spoke low, his voice flat as stone. "The master has decided. The boy cannot stay." His words carried the weight of a verdict, not a request. Ruth's voice cracked as she answered, "He is my son. He has done nothing. You'll have to take me too." Her hands gripped Isaiah tighter, her nails digging into his skin as though she could hold him to the earth by will alone. The overseers exchanged glances, their eyes sharp in the lamplight. One stepped forward, his hand on the rope at his side. Another shifted the shovel against his shoulder. They had not come to argue. They had come to end a story. What happened next was never written, never spoken plainly. Some said Ruth fought like a lioness, clawing and striking until she was thrown aside, her screams echoing into the fields. Some said Isaiah slipped into unconsciousness before they laid hands on him, his small body limp as if the earth itself had claimed him. Others whispered darker things, that no hand touched him at all, that he simply stopped breathing as the men stood waiting, as if the weight of their hatred had been enough. By morning, the shed was empty. The straw lay scattered, the blanket crumpled, but Isaiah was gone. Ruth's wails carried across the quarters, raw and endless, but no one dared ask the overseers where the boy had been taken. Some believed he had been buried in secret at the far edge of the fields. Others said the men had carried him to the river, letting the current swallow what they feared. And a few, whispering when the night was deepest, claimed they had seen Ruth slip into the woods alone, carrying something small wrapped in cloth. No record bore his name after that night. The master's ledger skipped from one week to the next, as though Isaiah had never existed. His place in the world was erased, his presence wiped away by silence. Only Ruth remained, hollow-eyed, her body bent by grief. She could not speak aloud. The children dared not say his name anymore, though sometimes in their games they spoke of a ghost boy in the shed, a figure, he who watched with pale-marked skin and trembling hands. Even the adults avoided the subject. On a plantation strangled by drought and superstition, some stories were too dangerous to tell. Isaiah had vanished, whether into the earth, the water, or the silence of memory. And in his absence, the fear that had named him a curse did not fade. It only grew sharper, heavier, as if the void he left behind demanded more than a child's life. The very next morning, the sky changed. Clouds gathered where none had dared linger for months, heavy and dark, rolling across the horizon like an army advancing at last. The air, once dry and sharp as ash, grew thick with the scent of rain. When the first drops fell, they hissed against the dust, vanishing as quickly as they came. Then came more, soft at first, then heavier, until the heavens opened and the earth drank deep for the first time in a season. Men ran into the fields, lifting their arms, mouths open wide to catch the water as it poured down. Women wept openly, their faces turned upward, their cries mingling with the steady drum of rain against rooftops. Children splashed barefoot in the puddles forming in the dirt, their laughter wild, their hunger forgotten for that brief moment. It was as if life itself had returned, washing the plantation clean. But amid the joy, whispers crept like vines. Some pointed toward the shed, empty and silent. "The boy is gone," they said, "and the rain has come." The words spread quickly, carried on every drop of water, growing louder with each hour. For many, it was no coincidence. It was proof. Isaiah's absence had lifted the curse. Ruth stood apart, her dress soaked, her hair clinging to her face. She watched the rain with hollow eyes, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. To her, the rain was no blessing. It was a cruel mockery, a reminder that the heavens had opened only after her son had been taken from her. Where others saw proof of deliverance, she saw betrayal, the sky itself complicit in their cruelty. The overseers wore satisfaction on their faces, as though they themselves had struck the bargain that brought the rain. "It is done," one said. "The curse has been broken." The master, though silent, did not deny it. He let the story settle into the soil, rooting itself as firmly as the cotton that would soon sprout again. His ledger moved forward, his losses counted, his profits waiting to return. For him, Isaiah was not memory, but an inconvenience erased. The enslaved, weary and desperate clung to the story because it gave them something to believe. In the rhythm of work and survival, they needed an explanation for suffering, and Isaiah had given them one. That he was only a child mattered less than the sense of order restored. His life had been the price, and the rain was the proof. That night, the plantation slept under the sound of steady rainfall, the earth drinking deeply, the air cooler at last. But for Ruth, there was no rest. She lay awake in her corner of the quarters, her hands pressed to her chest, her lips moving in prayers that carried no hope. The world had chosen its truth, but she knew another, the truth of a boy who had been only that, a boy. And she carried that truth alone, heavier than the rain pounding against the earth outside. Years passed, and the land healed as though it had never suffered. The rains returned each season, filling the wells, softening the earth, coaxing green back into the fields. Cotton rose high again, stretching across the plantation in rows of white, and with it came profit, and with profit came forgetfulness. Hunger dulled, death lessened, and the memory of drought turned into a tale told only when the sky darkened for too long. But Isaiah's name did not return to the ledgers. No record marked his birth, no record his death. He became a silence, a gap carefully left unspoken, as though his existence itself had been a blemish wiped clean. Children grew into adults who remembered the shed only as a place they once feared to go near. They told stories in whispers, daring each other in the dark. The boy who cursed the land lived there. They described eyes that glowed, skin marked like ash, hands that trembled with devil's touch. The truth, that he was only a child, slipped further away with every retelling. In the town beyond the plantation, the story stretched even larger. They spoke of the Carolina curse, of a boy born in sin who brought famine to the land. It became a tale preachers used in sermons, a warning told to restless children, a rumor carried in markets when rains came late. Each time it was spoken, the details changed. Some said he had horns, others that fire followed wherever he walked. Few remembered Ruth, the mother who held him against the tide. Fewer still spoke of the tears she shed each night when the world called her son a curse. Ruth herself grew old beneath the same heavy sun, her back bent, her hands worn to bone. She worked the fields in silence, her lips pressed tight, her eyes hollow. She never spoke Isaiah's name again, but she carried it inside her like an ember that would not die. In the quiet of night, she sometimes lifted her face to the sky, not in prayer, but in defiance, daring heaven to remember what the world had chosen to forget. And so Isaiah's story remained hidden, forbidden, not written in books, not carried in songs, but buried beneath whispers, shaped into legend by those who had feared him most. Yet if you listen close, beneath the rustle of the cotton and the hum of the cicadas, you might still hear the truth. A child who was never a curse, a boy condemned not by God nor nature, but by the cruelty of men and the ignorance of fear. The tale ends where it began, not with the wrath of heaven, but with the silence of a boy erased from memory. Isaiah did not bring the drought, nor the fire, nor the fever. The curse that haunted the plantation was never his. It was theirs. And in telling his story now, we unearth what they buried. That fear creates monsters where none exist, and that the greatest cruelty of all is to mistake a child for one. And so the forbidden tale of Isaiah ends, not in books, not in monuments, but in silence. His story was erased, reshaped into whispers of a curse that never was. But here, his voice has been spoken again. If this story has reached you tonight, I ask you to keep Isaiah's memory alive in the only way we can, by remembering, by refusing to let fear bury the truth. Before you go, make sure you are subscribed to the Macabre Record channel, where we bring you the tales history tried to forget. And in the comments below, tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Until the next forbidden story, stay watchful for what we bury in silence often returns to speak again.